Good morning, everyone. My name is Sean Armstrong, Dean of University College. Welcome to our last installment for this year's Master of Liberal Arts Lecture Series. The Master of Liberal Arts, or MLA, fosters intellectual breadth through courses that address a range of issues from different academic perspectives. It is our hope that these diverse viewpoints provide insight and promotes discussion beyond the talks in this series. Our theme this year is motion. To be perfectly still or frozen in time is a notable phenomenon. Motion, or change of position, is a more familiar state. This month, we explored ways that motion is truly remarkable, having an impact on our physical and social worlds, and on a smaller scale, our personal and work lives. Our series concludes this morning with a macro-level view of motion. Dr. Zakiya Luna will discuss social movements and their relationship to social change. Before we introduce our topic, I want to make you aware of a few housekeeping items. You see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You may submit questions at any time using that button. Our speaker has agreed to field questions at the end. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat button to ask for help. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Zakiya Luna is the Dean's Distinguished Professorial Scholar in the Department of Sociology. She is the author of Reproductive Rights as Human Rights, Women of Color, and the Fight for Reproductive Justice. She was the co-author and co-editor of the University California Press book series, Reproductive Justice, A New Vision for the 21st Century, and is currently working on an edited volume, Black Feminist Sociology, Perspectives and Praxis, with Whitney Pirtle. She was a Coraline Generative Fellow and member of the Humane Organization, and a member of the Humane Resources Innovation Lab, where her team focused on how reproductive justice movement organizations could be accountable to cultivating practices that recognize a person's whole self in order to help people thrive while sustaining the movement. Welcome, Dr. Luna.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sean. And let me just share my slides here. Okay, hopefully folks are able to see. Sean, could you give me a thumbs up? Thank you so much. Alrighty. Hi, I'm Professor Zakiya Luna. Thank you all for being here this morning. Thanks, Dean Matthews, for the invitation. I want to thank John Hinterland for all the help with the technical aspects of this. And thank you all for being here. Not just on a Saturday, but for those of us in St. Louis, it is Mardi Gras Saturday. For those of you who are joining from outside St. Louis and don't know what that means, it is a very busy time in town as St. Louis has the nation's second largest Mardi Gras. So thank you for that. And I also think it's really important to do a land acknowledgement. I'm in St. Louis, which is the unceded land of the multiple Native communities, including Osage community. And I just want to bring in that practice, which is actually something in the social movement spaces that I study is often becomes part of the ways that people start meetings, start presentations, right, do things really engaging in a practice, not just in theory, but in the everyday actions, right? So social movements is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And of course, in some ways, I'm sure audience assumes, of course, faculty, who are doing these MLA presentations, it's something that you'd love to talk about. But for me, it's also really personal in that I think the love of and the interest in social movements actually came from my mother. I remember from a very young age, one of my sisters and I joining my mom at an anti-apartheid vigil, candlelight vigil. And another of my sisters says she remembers turning on the TV one day and seeing my mom talking about some local issue that was happening in the Bay Area, right? So for me, movements and really just like civic engagement has been part of the upbringing and part of the understanding of how, as people, we engage in the world. But that's also not necessarily the case for everybody, right? And I teach courses on social movements, reproduction, and courses also on human rights. And I am actually right now teaching on social movements. So this is very well timed. And one of the things, I really like to start with is one, when I say social movements or you see social movements on the slide, what is it that you think about, right? And I'm going to guess that quite a few of the images come from media. That often is a source of how people understand social movements or learn about them. Some of you it might be because of your involvement, but based on what scholars know, statistically, that's actually not the case, right? So I always like to talk a little bit about like what do we as scholars talk about as social movements, and it helps sort of really frame the rest of what I'm going to talk about today. And social movement scholars, we think of movements, I'd say, in more specific terms than the average person does, or what you might even see represented or referred to as a social movement on mass media or even on social media, right? And that, we really talk about, social movements being sustained, right? Having collective aspects, right? That's, the social part. There's action involved, some type of movement, and generally, right, involving excluded groups, right? Excluded from a society. And sometimes it's groups that perceive themselves as being excluded, right? Even if based on the structures of a particular society, that's not actually the case. And often what we're looking at is sort of how these groups, right, large collectivities are interacting with authorities, right, political elites or the power brokers, right? And certainly those groups like authorities, political elites, there can be, depending upon the society you're in, that can shift a bit. But generally, like movements are about bringing people together collectively, right, to be stronger as a group, more stronger than as individuals, right? And so movements are ultimately about power and people trying to shift the distribution of power, right? So for me, that's part of why I am, even with movements that I don't disagree with, I'm always fascinated about the ways that people come together to try to make change, because that's ultimately what movements are about, right? And I think that in many ways, movements are ultimately about trying to create a different future, right? Which involves some level of imagination, right? And sometimes that is a future that has never been. Sometimes that is a future that is going back to, right, something, a time prior, right, or an imagined time, quite frankly. So, with that in mind, I'll give you just a little bit of background and sort of relative to many other topics, social movements is in some ways a newer topic, right? And particularly the way that we talk about it now, because there was a time for many social movements that there was sort of grouped together with things like riots or any sort of collective behavior, which could have been something like parades that are happening for Mardi Gras, right? Those are very different things, right? And in the early, let's say 30s, 40s, even 50s, right, people who were doing theorizing around movements, their understanding of, particularly like in the US, was that it was an open society, that people had access to power, right, that people could write a legislator, that they could actually make change through these formal mechanisms, right? And from that view, right, social movements were a problem, right? And that they were a symptom of strains on society. They were symptoms of people who were sort of aberrant and psychologically, sometimes like they went even far, that they were sort of psychologically damaged, right? Because why would people decide to get together and protest something, right, when you're living in this lovely society, right? And it wasn't really until we started having more scholars who had been involved in social movements who actually really questioned some of that and really said, hey, society, power isn't equally distributed, right? And particularly for me as someone as a sociologist, or some of you, if you've watched some of the other MLA talks from prior years, right, there's lots of evidence, right, that the US and many nations aren't, societies where power is equally distributed, right? And in fact, right, many of these scholars really looked at and said like, hey, we have so many examples of how power isn't evenly distributed, right? We have folks who, African Americans, right, who are living in segregated neighborhoods and states, right? Like that's not equal, right? Have here a picture of March on Washington, right? You also had folks, for example, who were looking at the Vietnam War and saying, hey, you know what, like only this is impacting different groups in different ways, right? And, we didn't really get a say about whether or not we are going to war with the small nation, that most of us know nothing about, right? And, or even this, I always, show my students this, that it wasn't until like the 26th Amendment, right, that the voting age was actually lowered to 18, right? And obviously there was a lot of folks who were being drafted into wars up to that point, but didn't actually have a say in electing, right, the legislators who were deciding, right? And so when you look at it from that perspective, you see there's so many ways actually that structurally, right, many people, whether it was young people, whether it was African Americans, and even then at that point, while women formally had the right to vote, right, it wasn't until early, late 60s, early 70s that women could get credit in their own name, for example, right? So there were so many ways in which actually society wasn't structured evenly, right? Wasn't structured so that everybody, had a say. And that's important to say because you still hear some of those narratives come up actually in representations of social movements. And when I see that, what I think about is, are people understanding how people are feeling about the distribution of power in a society, right? And how fair, how equal is it really? And that's really a big part of what movements are thinking about and what they're trying to shift, right? So, you can keep some of these images in your head, and I will put some others in there as well. So when we're talking about movements, we talk about, there's different types of movements, right? So there's reform movements, which are looking at a current society and current systems and saying like, hey, we want to make some tweaks to this, right? We want to make some changes. We think that there are things that could make it better, right? And often that involves things like, say, pointing to laws or something like that, right? But that's different than like revolutionary movements, right? Which often are saying, like this whole structure, like it doesn't matter how many small tweaks we make to it. And by small, obviously, like changing laws is not small, it takes a lot of work. But they're saying, making, these small adjustments isn't enough because at the core, right, we actually need to really shift massively how we're thinking about things, right, at the root, right, which is also why people think of these as sort of more radical, right, because when the word radical means sort of at the root. And so they're really questioning like the basis of society, right? And then there's also reactionary movements, right? So we have these sort of 3 R's, right? And those come about often, right, when one movement has been successful in making a change and they say, oh, hold on, we didn't like that change, right? Often, for example, you can point to particular policies, right? And people get mobilized and say, oh no, like we want things to go back to what it was like before, right? And that's important because, when people are looking at the news, right, or whether it's like mainstream media, whether it's your Fox News, your CNN, your MSNBC, or how things are talked about on social media, all of that gets collapsed into one and just gets referred to as a movement, right? Along with, things where people are doing like a one-off protest, right? Might be using a tactic of movements, but they're not necessarily part of movements. And I think of that, for example, and so it's important to understand that scholars do think of the sort of nuances, right? And that's also impacts sort of how these movements are emerging, what their goals are, right, what their plans are, and how we think about whether or not they are successful or not, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And just again, reminding you of that definition about what is a social movement. And so I'll talk a little bit about sort of how we talk about or think about the sort of life of a movement. And you might be like, wait, is that a mistake? What picture is that? That's a pool. That's on purpose. I promise. And movements, we think of them as having life cycles, right? So there's movements emergence, there's movements coalescing into, some people might think of sort of a critical mass, right? Then there's institutionalization, right? And sometimes that means like when movements are successful and they're able to access social institutions, whether that be educational systems, whether that be political bodies, right? It depends. And then often in movements, there's this time in which there's the bureaucratized. They start having more formal organizations, and that can be useful, but it can also be challenging and shift sort of how they're actually operating. And then there's decline, right? And there are some movements that and I showed some pictures, right, of some movements, right, that have much longer sort of durée, right, that also in some ways there might be moments of decline, and by moments I might mean like some decades, right, but people are still doing some of the work, and then when there's another time, another sort of set of opportunities, they come back up and they're sort of more broadly sort of recognized. But something really important is sort of, well, how do movements really get started, right? And that's why I have this image of a pool. And, when we talk about sympathy pools, and it might seem really obvious, right? But, there's people who are not sympathetic to a movement, right? But then there's the sympathy pool, right? And movements are often trying to get people more aware of their issues because they're trying to get people more sympathetic, right? Because if people don't even know about your issue, they can't even possibly imagine getting involved, right? And, why do people get involved in movements, right? Well, some of it might seem really obvious, but it's like, oh, because they care about an issue, right? But that's not all of it, right? And some people say, well, because they're angry about an issue, right? But the thing is, people are angry about things all the time, actually. Right? People are upset on the day-to-day about a range of things, right? But that doesn't mean that they get involved in a movement, right? And so certainly emotions are part of it, but there's also some other things that are part of it, right? And some of them might seem really simple, but they include things like people actually being asked to become involved, right? And scholars have done studies, right? Like how often are people actually asked to be involved? And one of the big predictors is whether or not you ask people, right? And that's of the people who are in the sympathy pool. And the other thing to think about, right, is that it's not just a matter of people having particular emotions and sentiments, positive sentiment towards a movement. It's not just about people being like, okay, there's some sort of way for me to get involved, right? There's another thing. And what we talk about as scholars is, thinking about like what separates people who are sympathetic to a movement and get involved as compared to people who are sympathetic but don't get involved, right? And again, there's people who just may not be aware, right? So that we're not talking about those folks, right? They might not be clear about how to get involved, right? Which is why movements are really engaged in the work of not just saying like, hey, we're here and we're concerned about this issue, but saying, hey, here's a way that you can help, right? It could be donating, it could be bringing water to a protest, it could be actually protesting, right? It could be a range of things, right? But, and if we were in a class right now, this is the activity I do, but this is what I do with my students to get this next concept across, biographical availability, is I have them like write down a list of the different things that they have due, right, for their classes, the different projects, different assignments, right? The different things going on in their life. For example, if they're working a job, right, they're scheduling. Some of them have caregiving responsibilities, right? So you got to think about that as well, right? And I have yet to do this activity and have a student say, oh, I don't have anything that's due. I don't have any other responsibilities, right? So for the average person who's not a student, right? In fact, people are like, what does that mean, a world in which I have nothing to do, right? There's some of you probably right now who, even as you're watching this, you might be replying to some emails from someone, you might be texting with your family about someone's birthday coming up, right? There's a whole set of things, right? You might be trying to help a kid with homework, right? All of these things, right? Contribute to what we talk about as biographical availability, right? And the fact is that depending upon the life stage people are in, right, things shift, right? So obviously people who have, when you have children, right, if you have children or if you have aging family members, right, and you're responsible for their care, that really shifts your ability to, even if you're sympathetic, right, to actually, right, contribute your time. Or to go to a meeting, for example, right? And so those things matter, right? And movements have to be thinking about that in the broader sense, depending upon sort of who they're trying to attract, right? And it's often the case, going back to that earlier definition and talking about excluded groups, right? It's often the case that excluded groups, right, are doing, right, for example, working multiple jobs because they're not getting paid as much in their jobs, for example, right, as sort of dominant groups, right? So that has an impact on their schedules, right? Or all sorts of other things. And so that's really one of the things, right, when we look at movements and their emergence, right, think about sort of how is it that people got there, right? And I think, we think about schedules, and then there's also the practical aspects, like how do they get there, right? Depends on what the different, say, protest event is or something along those lines. And that's really important because if people cannot actually contribute time, right, that's going to have an impact, right, on the effectiveness. And scholars have done some work looking at sort of any given society, what percentage of people are actually participating in movements. And there's some work by McAdam that looks at, even say when we look at like the new left activism of the 1960s, right, where people, and I had some of those images, people were like, oh my gosh, people were so involved with things, right? Looking at some of the data saying about 3% of folks were actually involved in that, right? And there's been some work out of political science with Erica Chenoweth, though, that started in 2000, initially published around 2011, and has been looking at sort of nonviolent movements globally, actually, right? And looking at those that were successful and those were not. And an interesting thing is that they were much more likely to be successful if they were able to garner 3.5% of the population actively engaged, right? It didn't guarantee their success, right? Now, on one hand, that seems like a really low number. On the other hand, when you start thinking about how many hundreds of millions of folks, right, are in it, depending upon the society, right? Like for the US, that would mean like around having the whole population of New York, right, actively engaged, right? And part of the reason that's important is because when you think about what I was just saying about biographical availability, right, even people who are sympathetic aren't all going to be able to participate, right? So it probably means that there's actually a lot more people who are actually sympathetic to the issues, right, who could, for example, try to donate for something, or maybe, if they're engaged, to vote in a particular way, right? But as far as people who are going to be able to engage in these sort of larger public things, whether it's protests, sometimes boycotts, things like that, right? And again, it doesn't guarantee success, right? But it does give a sense. And they continue to sort of do work around this, looking at things like the women's marches, movements for Black lives, right? And what does it really take to make change? And on one hand, that seems really small, and for some people really discouraging, like, wait, like even though we talk about the 60s, like New Left, like there was only about 3% of folks involved. I think another way to look at that is to actually say, wow, it's possible to make quite a bit of change with only 3%, 3.5%, wow, right? So, keeping that in mind, and as we move forward, I think a lot of times, what people see when they turn on the news, and I still, depending upon the age range of the audience watching, right? Some of us may remember turning on the news, whereas when I ask my students where they get news, some of them are like, well, I'll be honest, it's mostly, Facebook, Twitter, etc. But the point is, right, often what we're seeing is the highly visible things, right? And that's like the tactics, right? And movements, that's part of what movements do, but tactics are part of like broader strategies, right? And movements have different goals. Like, what do we want to change? Are we changing people's perspectives, right? Are we changing the laws about a particular group, right? Where are we going to focus it? If you're changing the laws, you're trying to focus on the state, right? The government. If you're changing perspectives, like it might be around the law, but it might actually be that you're trying to actually target media and sort of how they're representing your groups, right? Or it might be that you're trying to raise consciousness about particular dynamics and intimate relationships, right? And you think about sort of quote unquote second wave of feminism, and there was a lot of discussion about what it meant, gender inequality, what it meant in the home, what it meant in the workplace, right? That wasn't just about laws, it was about changing people's understanding of what women could do, right? Just as we saw that there are ways that, the US civil rights movement of the 60s, or even go back earlier, abolition movements around slavery, right? It was changing, yes, law, but also about perspectives, right? And understandings of the role of Black people in a particular society, right? And depending upon what your goals are and where you're trying to like target things, that's going to impact your tactics, right? And so again, the media is often showing the things that are going to bring eyes, right, to the news stations or to their pages. And so you certainly see things like rallies or you see big marches, right? But you're less likely to see things like petitions, right? It's not as exciting to show that, but that is part of some tactics, right? Vigils, right? You might see those sometimes, but sometimes not, right? But then there's other things that are happening like bailouts, right? That can be hard to show, for folks who are doing work around criminal justice, and they do sort of like national bailout days, right? Or around Mother's Day, there's folks who do things around campaigns about letter writing to mothers who are incarcerated, right? To draw attention to the sort of punitive ways that parents in particular are treated in the carceral system, right? But that's not necessarily going to make the news because it's kind of hard to show people writing letters and sending things, right? But there's so many things, right, that movements are trying, and depending upon what you're interested in, who you're trying to have an impact on, that can really make a difference, right? And so, and I have here a picture of, coming from a news source of, Occupy Wall Street, right? Part of how your tactic might be to do sort of sit-ins, things like that, right? Or it may be around boycotts. It really depends, right? And what you often don't see, and why I have these images here, is all the sort of strategizing that goes into that. In particular, what I show, and I've shown these in classes, right? The downtimes, right? When people are just talking, right? When they're saying, hey, what do we think about what just happened? Or they're saying, hey, we're going to be planning something, we're planning a protest, right? At City Hall, right? There was a protest on Monday at City Hall around housing, right? Well, that doesn't just happen out of nowhere, right? There's resources that are involved, right? Resources that have to be mobilized, which is, we have a perspective called resource mobilization in social movement scholarship. And, your resources, certainly people are a resource, but there's also money, there's also spaces for meetings, right? Because, for example, the image of Peruvian social movement activists, right, was a convening of folks from throughout Peru who've been working on a range of issues, including Afro-Peruvian folks, Afro and Indigenous folks, right? And they're sitting there, taking notes, talking with each other. There's translation happening, right? And that isn't necessarily, the fun, sexy stuff that gets shown in the media, but that is actually a really big part of movements, right? And I always think it's important to emphasize that, because when people see a protest or something, right, I always think, I wonder who actually put that together, right? Now, sometimes things just have every once in a while, right? But even still, when you look further back, you say, oh, right, there were networks involved with that, right? How did people get to that space? Well, people were communicating with each other, right? Right now, it might be through social media, through texting, right? But it was happening before in the US Civil Rights Movement, right? People were knocking on doors with each other, right? These things don't necessarily get shown, but this is a big part of movement work, right? And it's also part of movement work because you want people who are part of your movements, right, to feel invested. And part of that is talking about and sometimes struggling through, right, the different ideas people have for what happens next, right? And I always, think that, of course, people have a vision for the future, but no one has a crystal ball, right? And so you don't know how, for example, people are going to respond to your occupation. You don't know how they're going to respond to your protest. You might have some ideas of how that's going to happen, but you can't be 100% sure. So always trying to imagine a different future. You're trying to take actions to bring that into being while also dealing with the reality of a lot of unknowns, right? And trying to learn as you're going, right? Certainly people are able to, in many movement spaces, look at prior movements for what's worked and what hasn't, but ultimately, right, you are in those current conditions and you don't know, right, what is going to happen. Okay. And I think that that's something for people who are outside of movements can be, it isn't as known. And it's actually a big part of movement work. And sometimes you'll hear, whether it's on the media or social media, or even just, dinner table conversation where people are saying like, well, they should do this and they should do this and they should do that, right? And the challenge being, right, the information that people have, right? And also thinking about the skills, right, and the resources that you have available to you, right? And so that is a big part of it. And understanding that there is, as movement scholars, we think about the ways that there's actually quite a bit of organization that is required for movement sustainability, right? Because it's one thing to be able to do a one-off protest, or maybe two-off protests, but it's a different thing when, it's often the case that first time around, right, you are not going to get what you are trying to achieve, right? So what happens? What do you need to do to be able to sustain a year, 2 years, right? How do you keep people involved? How do you keep people interested? How do you keep people committed, but also, right, continuing to attract new people? And what that means is that there's constantly education happening as new people are entering the movement space or potentially entering it, right? While also keeping people who've been there longer term, and maybe if they're lucky, they've been able to see some successes, but often what they're seeing is actually, let's say, lessons, failures and lessons, right? And that can be really disheartening, right, for movements, right? No matter sort of what type of movement, no matter where they're standing on an issue, right? To not see success, right, can be really challenging. And so it's also about thinking about how do we keep people engaged in those realms, right? Knowing that everybody has, other aspects of their lives going on, right? And so that's where also in movement spaces, why like people are meeting in different spaces, why they're also thinking about, and this might not seem so obvious from the representation, but why they're also thinking about, how sometimes, how do you make things interesting and fun for people, right? Like there's a lot that goes into these sort of emotional aspects of movements, right? Sometimes the physical aspects of movements as well. And, how do you keep people interested and sustained, right? And that is a constant, right, sort of thing people are thinking about in movement spaces and movement leaders, right? And also, how do we do things differently if needed? And if we need to do things differently, how do we keep people, how do we get buy-in, right? And so I think that's really, why I included these in here, because these aren't necessarily the types of images that fully get shown in media, right? And as movements are doing that, as I mentioned, right, they're also trying to tell the story from their perspective, right? And, I just have a couple examples here of different things. So for example, right, by this point, many folks have heard about Black Lives Matter, right? They've heard about this, and they've seen the hashtag or something, and they've heard the phrasing, right? And that's part of it, right? But, there's also, right, and for many people, summer 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, right, there was a lot of sort of response to that, right? But the work around sort of fighting, challenging police brutality, even under the sort of banner of Black Lives Matter, or more broadly, right, even the many folks who were involved in this work, but weren't part of Black Lives Matter chapters or any of that, right? That had been happening, since 2014 and that sort of iteration. But you can look back even further and look at the work that was happening in the 60s and 70s of fighting police brutality, right? So there's a lot of folks, right? Like you're engaging in these attempts to bring awareness to the broader issues that you're working on. And you can never fully predict when people are going to be paying attention, what moment will bring them to pay attention, right? And so you're both trying to move forward with your tactics, you're both trying to get people to, listen to you. You're also trying to get, people, power brokers to listen to you, you're trying to get people sympathetic, and so there's a lot of that work, right? That's all happening at the same time. There's so many moving parts with movements, right? Movements are moving, right? Or for something, there's been a lot of attention around criminal justice system, right, policing, right, the murders of Black people, right, at the hands of police, and people have put that under under the banner of Black Lives Matter. It's not all under that banner, actually, right? But what's really interesting, and this is what this other image shows, right, is that even though, right, the folks who are most sort of associated with this sort of hashtag Black Lives Matter are 3 queer Black women, right, who were sort of responding to Trayvon Martin at that time, that representation is of police brutality only being against Black men, right? Well, that's not actually practically, the case. And so you had, for example, the Say Her Name, right, movement, right, developing and saying, okay, like it's important to say the names of the Black women who've also, right, been murdered by police, right, whether it was Sandra Bland, right, or Shelley Frey, or Kayla Moore. And this image is of so the mothers, right, who lost their children, their daughters, at the hands of police. And part of the whole point of that movement was and continues to be to say, let's remember the Black women and girls killed by the police as well, right? It's not to say that Black men killed by the police doesn't matter. They're saying like, this affects everybody in the community, right? And there's particular ways, right? And I think that many people became more aware of that with the, with Breonna Taylor's death, right? So there's times at which, when movements that are under a broad banner, right, within the movements, there's folks who say like, yes, and also we think it's important that we talk about this aspect of it, right, as well, and bring attention to the unique ways, right, whether it's Black women or queer folks, right, or folks at the intersections are impacted by this issue. And then you also see in some examples of folks who are doing work in one arena, who are also trying to shift the framing and the broad understanding of the issue and connect it to other issues, right? So quite a bit of the work that I do is around the reproductive justice movement, right? Which is a women of color led movement that, there've been women of color, Black, Latina, Asian Pacific Islander, Indigenous, involved in reproductive activism for decades and decades and decades, right? But also, right, many of them said like, but the ways some of that gets framed as about choice, and around abortion specifically is pretty limited, right? Because we're also fighting for, rights to have children, fighting against forced sterilization, for example, and rights to parent our children, right? Because our children are much more likely, for example, to be killed by police, right? Statistically, like disproportionately. And so you have folks working around issues of, yes, reproductive health, concerns around, birth control, around abortion access, but also saying like it's important to talk about environmental issues, right? And how that impacts our neighborhoods and our kids' health, right? It's important to talk about police violence, right? And how that impacts our children, right? And so you see also this sort of, say, bridging of the ways these issues are being framed, right? And saying like, that you deserve to parent your children without fear that he or she will be hurt or killed, right? Freedom from violence is reproductive justice, right? And so you see at times, right, movements coming together, right, and making concerted efforts. And that doesn't always get picked up by the media, but I'll say like that work happens on the ground, right? And, you get a poster like this because you have a young cultural worker who's working with their Peel Hide Art Project saying like, how do we also get people to think about this in a different way, right? Let's talk about cultural production. Let's talk about that, right? And so movements are also trying to, literally use images, language, right? To get people to understand the issues, not just statistics, right? Which sometimes that's all you hear on the news, right? They're trying to get at people's understanding, their hearts and their minds, right? And so these are just some of the examples. And Sean, let's see, sorry, one sec. I'm gonna take a quick look here. Yeah, okay, good. Sorry, I was looking really quickly. All right, okay, at the questions. And movements are also, right, engaged in sometimes very disruptive tactics, right? And so some of you may have seen this. This is, Valentine's Day is the anniversary of the Parkland shooting, right? People have been involved in work around gun reform for a really long time, right? Decades, right? And there's a lot of resistance to that work, right? And sometimes, people are brought into movements and often, very much from their personal experience, right? And so on Valentine's Day, you had Manuel Olive, one of the fathers of the Parkland victim, who scaled a crane in DC and brought attention, right? And saying, hey, Biden, you haven't been doing enough around this issue, right? And I think sometimes people, and this happens in my classes, assume like, oh, okay, people who are involved in a movement are only, trying to, if they're targeting legislators, right, or presidents, it's only around certain political parties. And so that's no, like often, right, it doesn't, presidents, represent, sure, one aspect, but the fact is, right, even when they, parties shift, there's this larger structure that's being contended with, right? So whether it was under Trump, whether it was under Bush, whether it was under Clinton, right, there's been people who've been advocating around gun reform for decades, right? And it's continually and saying, this is our issue, and we want you to hear us, and we want you to hear those who cannot speak, right? Because, or whether it's they have been killed, as in the cases of Parkland victims, or because due to life circumstances, they cannot actually take the time to be here, right? And so you see this, and I think that there was a question about sort of like what's most effective. And it's like, that depends on what you're trying to do, who you're trying to target, and what I mean target, like as in whether it's legislators, whether it's about sort of changing cultural understanding, right? And movements often have multiple goals, multiple targets. And I know that can seem really messy, but I often say like the way to understand like what's most effective and also what's most desired from that movement is to talk with folks who are involved, right? And that's one of the things that I think for many movement folks can be really challenging is they say, hey, we need help. Great, like contact us, whether through, if we are, bureaucratized and we have an office, call the office, see what is it that people need help with, right? Is it that, movements are often like, hey, donations are great, but also, sometimes, folks are doing campaigns where folks are supposed to email legislators, but sometimes not, right? It depends on what they're really focusing on, right? They might have a different sort of target at that time. And part of that is because movements are really having to assess the current environment they're in. And there's a lot of moving parts, right? And what works in St. Louis, right, may not work in Oakland, California, right? for example, there's protest tactics that may work in certain places, right? So this was protesters in Oakland who were on highways, right? And they blocked traffic, right? 880 is a big highway, as you can tell. And it might seem obvious, but if you don't have highways, right, that tactic doesn't work, right? It's not necessarily an option for you, right? It doesn't necessarily have the same impact to disrupt people's everyday sort of commute if, right, there's not that many commuters, right? So the tactics and what's wanted, is really dependent on what's going on at that time, and also sort of how disruptive, right, movements are trying to be, right? Some movements are trying to really disrupt, right, and really sort of, there's sort of shocks, right, and they want people to pay attention in that way. Others, and you see this a lot with, reformist sort of spaces, right, they're trying to change things, but without being, being appropriate, disruptive to a point, but not say necessarily trying to shock people, right? So they might try different sort of mechanisms, whether it's petitions or emailing legislators or things like that. And then you also see in movements, you can see a range, right? Depends on sort of what's going on at that time, right? So I have just a few more slides here, and I'm going to take a sip of water. One second. Okay, good. All righty. And I'm just showing you, oh, absolutely. Yes, thanks so much, folks. And we also have, we call protest waves, right? And that is something actually that many of us saw, actually starting with, the election of Donald Trump, right? We saw the sort of mobilization into action regarding the women's marches, for example, right? But then you started to see other types of protests, whether it was climate marches, things like that. And then, it seemed like, oh, well, maybe there was sort of a lull. And then you had, right, the murder of George Floyd, and we saw massive numbers of people, right, protesting, right? And for some people, it was the first time they became aware of the issue, right? Whereas for others, it had been a longstanding issue, whether they dealt with personally, right? Those of us who personally dealt with police violence, right? Or were aware of it happening in their community, right? So obviously I'm in St. Louis, right? So in 2014, when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, right, there was a lot of attention, right, around that time, right? And so there's some people, who weren't necessarily paying attention at that time, right, or whatever was going on. And then, years later, in the middle of the pandemic, right, where many more people were inside, were whether watching TV or catching up on Netflix, a whole set of things, right? And there was those moments, right, where people were actually still, right, and their sort of biographical availability changed, right, because whether it was that they were working from home or they'd been laid off, right, and they had more time to sort of consume some of the news and learn about things, right, and they see this thing, right, and they go, oh my gosh, right, and also we have changes in sort of ability to access what's going on in other places through social media. And so, this is just an image from Mount Pleasant, Michigan, right? How often, do people think about what events are happening in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, or happening in small cities, right? But you saw, right, this sort of large wave and sort of this outpouring of folks saying, hey, like, we think this is wrong, right? And not everybody who attends a protest, or in this case, you had people laying down and sort of for the 9 minutes that George Floyd had the officer's knee at his back as he was being killed, right? You have new tactics that emerge, right, at different times because of whatever the particular precipitating event was, right? So this is the other aspect when I'm saying that movements move, it's because, right, they're responding to what's going on at the time, and they can certainly learn, but also they're also having to deal with the opposition, right? And some of the times the opposition is, for example, state authorities, whether it's police, right? One image is from desegregation attempts in Boston. But then, this was around, this image is from a news story about Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, which, again, just a few miles from here, right? But it may also be, right, individuals, right? And, the issues I work on around reproduction, these are two different images right here, if you see, taken decades apart at the Supreme Court. And you have, there's movements and there's also counter movements, right? So there's folks who are fighting for, who successfully, fought for federal sort of legal access to abortion, right? And in the 70s, right? And that actually mobilized, right? What at the time had been pretty small and sort of disparate anti-abortion, sort of pro-life, right? Sort of groups, right? And that sort of was a wake-up call for many of them, right? And Kristen Luker, one of my mentors, has done work on this, right? There were folks who decided, oh, we never thought that like abortion would become legal federally, like we knew in some states it was happening, but what? And that, there's these moments that really sort of, oh my gosh, sort of moral shocks for folks that then can mobilize, right, a counter movement, right? And there's some movements, right, that you can look over time and see that they are continually in this sort of lockstep fight with each other, right? Whether it's at the legal level, grassroots level, and that's why you can have these images taken decades apart that look almost the same. The signs are a bit different. Obviously, the people are a bit different, but you still see them engaged in these debates. And, we see this in Missouri, right? Like, and various other states. And yet you also then see people continuing, right, to mobilize and say, hey, we're most impacted by this issue. We want you to hear our voices, right? It's not just about legislators. It's not just about the courts. It's not just about what this person over here thinks. Like, this is actually, an issue that affects me, right? And so there's also the issues that bring a lot of attention and emotional sort of resonance for folks. So whether it's 2019 Atlanta folks fighting abortion bans or 2021, right? You saw, and there's still protesters, right? Whether it's at the Senate in Texas or in other spaces, right? Who are really sort of paying attention and saying, hey, this is not okay. Or you see people sort of in solidarity with folks in different states, right? Even if their state isn't facing that particular threat, they'll say, hey, we're going to support this, whether by giving money to folks in those states or doing a sort of solidarity, so we boycott or something like that, which you might then see another way that people engage in those protests. And I really think, people are often like, well, how do we know if movements have been successful? And, I think the reality is like movements have different goals, and the reality is, right, sometimes they're successful or partially successful, sometimes they're not. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? Because movements aren't just working in a vacuum, right? As I was just showing you, there can be a lot of opposition to a movement, right? And so that's why as scholars, we really think of it in the long term, because the fact is that over time, right, any particular moment, right, there may have been a failure, but then you might look a few, the lessons learned from folks who are involved in those movements are taken to the next stage. And a few, years later, they're able to be successful at getting a policy changed, right? Or they're able to change cultural representations of a particular group slowly, right? And you may then look back and say, wow, like that group is presented in a much, more positive light, right? And we saw this with LGBTQ folks, right? That the sort of broader representation in mainstream media or, is very different than it was, right? Even, 20 years ago, when I think about things that were allowed, on TV when I was younger, right? And so it's often, it's often a mixed bag, right? And that's why, though, movements are constantly trying to make people aware of their issues, of their successes and the possibilities, because really they're trying to imagine a different future. And they're trying to get people to say, hey, we want to imagine that future with you, right? And so I think it's always, I always like to leave on a sort of hopeful note, because I think movements are about change and hope. Like I said, even when I don't agree with them, I do think, right? And I think we can just look at around, and I look around my classrooms and I say to students, like, this is about movement success, right? The fact that there are women in here, the fact that there are Black people here, Latino people here, that there are a whole set of folks here, the fact that, you know, there's disability accommodation, right? That just didn't just come about, right? A disability rights movement really fought for changes in educational institutions so that all students could access education, right? So sometimes movements are so successful, right, that people don't even realize, right, that there was a time when something didn't exist, right, before the movement said that. Or, you know, as the labor movement says, like, you know, the folks who gave you the weekend, right? And so I think in many ways, right, that's sometimes the goal of movements actually, like that something becomes so part of a cultural fabric that people in some ways take it for granted, but also always keep in mind though that, you know, any rights that are won, you know, can be taken away and need to be struggled for. And, you know, going back to what I started with, you know, as I mentioned, you know, my mom was involved with a lot of things. And, you know, I think of, you know, this was the sort of perspective she had about, you know, that this engagement was about, you know, being part of a human, right? Being part of wanting to actually have a positive impact on your society. And, you know, there's so many issues out there and different ways for people to get involved. And I, you know, try to remind students like, yeah, you're not powerless. Like there's actually a lot that any one person can do, particularly when you get a whole bunch of these one people together. And so I just want to end on that note, and then I will head to the questions. So thank you all for being here on a Saturday to hear a little bit about movements and social change and possibilities. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Luna. There are questions in the Q&A, and I invite other people to add questions. You started to, or did address the question about how people can best get involved in movements. Part of the question was that this was someone who was part of a group of 40 well-informed retirees. Are there generational differences in the way people might be involved or the way people might have impact?
I mean, I think there is, yes and no, right? Like there's, in the sense that when we think about the life course and where people are at in their lives, right? Sort of where do people have the most time, right? The most time that is under their control, right? And that can be, for example, in this question, someone said, oh, you know, retirees, right? So that does mean, right, that people are not working a 9 to 5, or for many people a 9 to 8. You know? So it does mean that there is more availability of time, right? And it's also why actually movement spaces, there's often a lot of, I mean, depends on the movement, but there's often a lot of desire to try to bring in young people because they've got a lot of energy, right? I mean, I always am like, when I go in a classroom, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, you want to feel old, go into a classroom. Even when I was a grad student, I was like, undergrad, they've got a lot of energy. But even folks who aren't students, right, who are still younger, right, there's a lot of energy and possibility and excitement about, and sometimes it's, you know, like literally like biologically less need for sleep, right? But also then you have, right, older folks who have a lot of wisdom and lessons learned, right? And often more resources, right, than say younger people, right? If things have gone the way we hope they have, right? And time is a resource for movements, right? It's not just money that's a resource. Time is a resource, right? So there's the reason why I say like, okay, but you know, it's also about knowing sort of where movements are at, like what are they trying to do with their particular campaigns, right? Movements typically are working on some types of campaigns, right? And it could be that they're trying to, if they're working on a particular policy issue, they're trying to get a legislator or multiple legislators to vote a particular way, right? So they'll say, hey, we do want you, hey folks, please email this legislator, call this legislator, try to call, speak with their intern, most likely, you know, or like leave a message, say I'm in your voting constituency or something, you know, and show them that there's people who care, right? And try to get some sort of, you know, response there, right? But if they're working on something different, right, they may want something else actually, right? They might be working on, and this might sound strange, but sometimes they're working on things like billboard campaigns, right? And they're working with artists and they want to have their issue represented and they want it to be in high traffic places. And, you know, it takes time to actually, figure out what are the most high traffic places? How much does it cost to do that thing? And they might say like, hey, we want someone to actually like call these places and figure out what's the most recent prices, right? Because we're working on getting some people to donate so that we can put these things there, right? So it also depends on what they're trying to do, right? And the final thing I'll say with that, that's also why there's often a stage of bureaucratization in movements, not always, but because, right, for many people just sort of out there, they're like, okay, like I see these people doing these things. I don't necessarily want to do that thing, right? Protest, comes with particular risks. It also, there's time issues, there's a whole set of things, right? Okay, so if you have some organizations, people can call an organization, right? They feel more comfortable, right, donating, for example, in that space, rather than like someone who just says, I'm part of this movement, right? They're like, okay, we're trusting you to sort of do the due diligence, to do the work of assessing where that's needed, but also that means that they can say like, hey, we have 5 people who are interested in helping us. Here's what we need, right? And so I often think, getting in touch with folks who are working, organizations aren't the only way, right, for movements, but it helps other people to know, like, well, how can I get involved? They'll let you know, right? And so I think that that's something important because it also depends on what you're doing in a particular state, in a particular county. What people are doing in California isn't the same as what people are doing in Missouri, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. Just yesterday, I attended virtually the first in a 3-part series entitled Rethinking System Design for Racial Justice and Equity, sponsored by the Ohio State Divided Community Project, the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, and Stanford Law School's Gould Center for Conflict Resolution. I learned about the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation movement. Do you agree that it should be called a movement?
So I would ask, I have a follow-up question, because for me, I think about, okay, we're talking about truth, justice, and reconciliation movement. There's, for example, famously South Africa, right, post-apartheid, right? Like that was a lot of sort of movement work that was happening. Or are they, and from the description, I can't tell, or are they talking about people learning a particular set of skills to bring into, say, workplaces? And so it helps to have a little bit more background, because I think actually what to me this gets to is that a lot of things get called movement sort of broadly. Even sometimes, I've literally seen things where, I don't know, a fast food company will have a new product and they'll be like, join the movement and eat this thing, right? Like, it's not a movement, right? They're not trying to make any political change. They're not trying to actually, like, who are the oppressed groups there? Like that's not, so I would want a little bit more information.
Sure.
And I would also think about like sort of what are the structures that are trying to be changed, right? What is the sort of longevity of it, right? There is this category of, and this is why I didn't talk about it much in the beginning, there's sort of, and sort of some older scholarship around thinking about self-help movements. But the problem there becomes, okay, what is the sort of larger goal, right? Movements are about people being engaged socially, right? That's why we say social movement, right? So it's not only about individuals like changing, that is part of it, right? But it's about the sort of, what are the broader changes people are trying to make and thinking about those broader political structures, right? So that's what the questions that I have when I hear just, the naming, and I sort of say, well, what's the context of it, right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. On the commercialization theme, what are your thoughts on the commercialization of movements? It's so surreal to see Black Lives Matter on Amazon Prime, or Nike doing a promotion with Kaepernick, or Black Lives Matter leaders being brought into celebrity culture, yet Black people are still being killed by police.
Yeah. So this is a very interesting thing as far as movements, right? So there's a couple of things that we talk about, scholars and thinking about movements. And that includes sort of potential for co-optation by like the state, right? Often movements are trying to challenge, right, government sort of. So there's the potential, right, of that through like sort of smaller concessions. And then there's also like people talk about mission drift, right? Which is like, okay, what was the initial goal? And how does this actually, this specific tactic, how does it actually help with that, right? And I think that's what anonymous attendee is actually talking about, right? And saying, well, how does it help for an individual to be engaged in a high profile product placement or something like that, right? And on one hand, people say like, well, that brings visibility around an issue that a set of people just did not know about, we're still not paying attention to, right? There's still people who don't know about Colin Kaepernick, right? It might seem very obvious to, to some folks who've attended this, like, well, of course people know about this, or of course they know about that. And sometimes with my students, they're like, well, of course people do. And I'm like, do you know how much information is out there? Actually, there are so many things going on that people don't know about, right? So it is quite possible, right, that Nike doing a promotion with Colin Kaepernick could bring attention to, right, taking a knee. But the question we ask is, and what people who are critical of that ask is, okay, but at what cost? Right? Especially when you get to things like Amazon or Nike, or even there was a recent example given, UGG boots campaign, right? We'll say, well, at what cost? And especially if you're in the cases trying to actually challenge, right, some of these places, right? Say particular workplaces and say, hey, you need to have better representation of African Americans, right? What does it mean then to take money, right, in those spaces, right? And I think Amazon's a good example because, and multiple sort of movement leaders have talked about how, actually I remember listening to Alicia Garza do an interview talking, she had been doing, work organizing with the Domestic Workers Alliance, right? Which is something that Ai-jen Poo and multiple folks have been working on, for decades, and was asked by Walmart to do an ad for them, and she's like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, in my view, like you, Walmart, like you are a really big exploiter of your workers, right? And so it wouldn't make sense for me as someone who's doing work around labor organizing and has been working with domestic workers to like say, take money from you, right? Like that really just is total in conflict. And so I think and I think that's where, I, do interviews with people who are formal leaders, and then you talk with participants, and sometimes like there's a disconnect, right? And it depends on how broadly the sort of movement has gone and how long it's been going. And I think that is a challenge for movement leaders, which is always, hearing the people who continue to be doing work on the grassroots, even as you were getting more attention, right? And I think that that's something that, quite frankly, in all sorts of movements around all sorts of sides, people struggle with, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Right, that's a little bit of a different question. What common traits of personality, psyche of people who create movements?
Yeah, I saw that one, and I think it's interesting. So there is some work, and I say this, some of the sort of earlier work around movements was really focused on the sort of psychology of it. But part of the reason that that work fell out of favor is because, right, the sort of individualizing around folks, right? And social movement scholars broadly are interested in sort of, yes, there are certain conditions that make it more likely, right, that people are going to participate. And what are those conditions, right? And so when I was talking about biographical availability, that's part of it, right? Because you can have people who are supportive, right, sympathetic around movements, but they don't get involved, right? And there's many scholars like find the sort of answer of, oh, well, it's just because they're not, good people or something like that. That's dissatisfying, right? And it doesn't really reflect the reality, right? The reality is that for many people, the structural conditions in which they are living in the day-to-day have a big impact on literally how much time they have, how much knowledge they have, right? And we know that because you can do these broad surveys, whether it's Pew or otherwise, and you say, oh, are you concerned about this issue? Are you concerned about that issue? And people say, yes, I am. Yes, I am, and they say, but they're not involved, and say, oh, okay, but what else do we know about their life, right? Which is why we move away from the sort of individual psychologization and get to the broader structural conditions, right? Because again, there's people who are upset about a range of issues all the time. There's people who are sympathetic around it. And an individual answer doesn't get at that, right? Like as far as movement emergence, it's things about like what type of resources are available, right? Both for that in that person's life, but then also at the broader movement level for people to get involved, right? Mm-hmm. And what type of networks do they have? And that's why, I mean, it sounds silly, but some of the work of David Meyer and even also some work coming out of the organizing approach, people said like one of the big predictors is whether or not people even get asked to participate in something. That might seem so silly, but that's actually like a really big deal. Like some people like, they don't feel like they have enough knowledge or enough skill or something, right? But if someone who's in their network says like, hey, I'm going to this thing, do you want to come? You're like, oh, I might be that type of person, right? Who could do that, right? And that's where I think the sort of broad media images can have negative impacts because people see it as like, oh, it's this very unusual thing. Like, oh, you have to be willing to, get arrested, do all that. Like actually the vast majority of work that's happening in movements is really, quite frankly, mundane, day-to-day, like meetings, that type of stuff, right? And when you say, well, many people in their average life are part of meetings, are part of different things and have those skills, right? So that is part of that sort of way that think about those commonalities. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Is there a means of identifying a quality movement as opposed to a movement based on disinformation or disingenuous rationale? What are the characters of those more quality efforts? Would it be history of leadership or organizational framework, for example?
Okay.
You gotta deal with the quality question.
Yeah, well, I'm like, I think there's a question behind the question.
Yeah.
But so, and this is something and why I said, even movements I disagree with. There's something that as scholars and individuals say, okay, what's going on there, right? And we can find some common traits, right? For example, people being dissatisfied. That's one thing, sure. People having an availability of time, right? As I've talked about, there's some things that are common across, right? Movements that make it more likely for a movement to emerge, including things like networks, right? Now, the question is, what type of networks are you involved with, right? And I think it can be really hard, and this is something that I work with in my classes with students, right? To take the other's perspective. And if we imagine, and this actually does get to the psychology, although this is not my area, if we imagine that most people are going through the world sort of thinking of themselves as a good person, right? And that they understand their own logics for doing things, right? And they say they feel justified in how they're approaching things. If we start from that place, that can help us better understand movements that can seem, for some folks, highly irrational, highly disingenuous, based on disinformation. And partly though, say, well, what, and this might sound really strange, right? But if you're in a particular worldview, this all makes sense, right? It all makes sense. And quite frankly, right, some of these folks would have the same question about their opposition. They'd say, wait, these people are doing things based on disinformation, right? They're disingenuous, right? And so that's the thing about sort of movement, the work that we're looking at, and we look at sort of these common sort of characteristics across movements, right? And ideology is a big part of it, right? It's just that they have different ideologies, right? And a different vision of what that shared, what that future should look like. But they believe just as rightly, in the sense of their righteousness, right? Of their perspective. And yeah, so that's part of how we generally as movement scholars are looking at those things, right? So, and if we think about quality, we think about like, how broad are the networks, right? How broad, what type of resources? And also there's this other thing that for those of us who do more sort of in-depth work in movements, not just sort of looking broadly, is, how is it that what movements are saying they want to do, how are they actually doing that in their own movement spaces, right? And that's something we call prefigurative politics, right? So if people say, we want to liberate people, we want to have or broad democratic ways of engaging in the world, how much does that actually operate in their own movements, right? And that can also be a clue about sort of the ways in which they are or not aligned. Yeah.
And I think we have time for one more question. This one gets at, the idea of a movement actually being so effective that it gets rid of the thing it's moving against. So,
Yeah.
So I was wondering if strikes as a form of movement can redefine class to the extent that it might even somewhat abolish it, or at least make us rethink normative hierarchical class systems as well as time and late capitalism.
Okay, so I'm going to reread that one just for myself. Okay. So strikes as a form of movement. So I think if I should clarify, I think strikes is a tactic within movements, right? So we might see general strikes, we might see specific work like labor strikes, right, which is the thing people are probably most familiar with, in which you're sort of withdrawing of your labor. And then whether or not strikes can redefine class to the extent that it might even somewhat abolish it. So, okay. I'm not familiar with the book that has been referenced in there, but here's what I'll say. And this actually, interestingly, someone had a question and they said that they were an MSW. So I actually have an MSW as well, in community organizations and community social systems. And something that actually people who are doing sort of grassroots organizing do talk about is, like, can you imagine a world where you've been so effective that there is not a need for your movement anymore, right? And what would it take for that to be the case, right? What relationships would have to be transformed? What institutions would have to be transformed, right? And that actually can be a really scary thought, even for people who are like, whoa, what do you mean? Like, to not have it. And that's where that sort of bureaucratization can be a challenge, right? Because when you have organizational spaces, right, that are sort of helping condense the resources of movements. On one hand, that can be great because people outside it could know who to call and there's a way of vetting, right? But then this question comes up of like, wait a second, if people's paychecks are coming from this, what happens? Uh-oh. If you get to a place where like you don't need this anymore, right? So you can see that sort of tension there. I think it is actually a really great question, right, for being involved in movement spaces, or movement supporters, to think about like, what would it take for the movement to not exist, right? What would have to happen regarding policing, right? For a broad movement for Black lives to not need to exist, right? What would have to happen regarding incarceration for an abolition movement to not exist, right? And again, that can seem super overwhelming because it's like, oh my gosh, so many things would have to happen. But that's actually what movements are trying to do in some ways, right? Some movements. And the fact is, these systems they're fighting against, right, are composed of so many intricate parts, right? And the way I think of that is that it also means, though, that people can get involved in so many different ways, actually, right? Because there's all these different levers, right, that are adding up to whatever the particular injustice is, right? That also means that there's so many ways to sort of unravel it and that everybody, can have a part in it. So that I think is an important question to be thinking about. And, can I actually answer Barbara's question?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Someone asked about, appropriation or, what happens if you have a lot of time available, but other people might look at, and say like, well, what does that issue have to do with you, right? And so one, I mean, if you think of the world as sort of interconnected, right, there's a way in which all issues actually impact everybody, right? We're all part of a society, sort of nationally and also globally, right? But I think part of that is about, building trust, right? And that trust is a process and it's a continual thing. And I think that's part of it. Think, I can build the trust and that'll carry over. But the fact is, right, trust is a continual process. And that's within movements, whether it's people who it seems like the issue obviously affects them or doesn't affect them, right? And I think if you think of it that way, like movements are a process, building that relationship is a process, right? And that means that takes time. And so I think that that's also another reason why it's important to think about movements as sort of being part of a long-term process, right? And about building those relationships over time, both within folks who are within the movement, with folks who are outside the movement and want to learn more about it, right? Building relationships with, this might sound strange, power holders, right? So that you can come to understand sort of where they're coming from, et cetera. And I think it also, the other part of it is movements do take humility, right? Because anytime you see a protest or some sort of tactic out there were people who helped create that, right? You're stepping into a conversation, right? And just as what would be happening if 3 people were talking on the street, like you wouldn't just barge in and be like, well, you all should be doing this, right? In fact, you'd say like, oh, hey, what's going on here? I'm curious, what had happened, what were you all talking about before? Oh, and you think about like, how is it that I can fit in here, right? And like you develop that relationship over time. And I think that that's a big part of it, right? Is giving oneself the time, giving each other the time, right? And knowing that there's always more to learn, right? No one knows everything. And that's because, again, movements move. And so I think that's really about sort of building that trust, those relationships of accountability, so that you can move together to make that change.
On that, thank you so much. I want to join our audience who thank you for the wonderful lecture. I also want to thank our audience for the questions and for those of you who have been here throughout the month following us as we move through these different motions. Thank you so much for being here. And Dr. Luna, again, thank you and have a good day, everyone.